Metabolic V2. This is a super safe and effective natural anabolic. Not only is this product going to help you increase protein synthesis, which basically means muscle recovery and growth, it also may inhibit myostatin, which is a protein in your body that is known to inhibit muscle growth. This is a complete natural anabolic that works through multiple different pathways, has multiple trademarked ingredients. If you are a natural athlete looking for that edge, Corbic V2 is what you need. Get yourself some.
Hello and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Pro Physique Code. So today we've got a pretty awesome guest on here. We're going to be talking about hormones and fat loss. Do they actually have any impact on fat loss? And we're going to kind of go through a couple of the key ones. We're certainly going to be talking a lot about some insulin. We're going to be talking about testosterone and a few other things. So our guest here today is Dr. Joe Klonzeski. I have been actually running through that last name as well to make sure I could say it right on the podcast today. I was like, Klonzeski. It always sounds good in your head, and then as soon as maybe you say it out loud, you mess it up. So I was muttering it to myself throughout the day. He's been a great friend of mine, I want to say, for almost close to 10 years. I think we met at one of Paul's very first camps that he ran that long ago. And so we've been able to have a great relationship. I just want to give you an opportunity to maybe introduce yourself here real quick to our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work and who you are. And then, as we kind of get through that, we'll start to dive into a few things.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. And thank you, Christine and Tyler, for having me. And of course, Paul, as always, for having information platforms like this to spread the good news of fitness. I started out as an athlete, first of all, baseball player as a young kid, and then trying to get stronger for my career, moving into high school and so forth. I just got swept into bodybuilding as a culture. So in the 80s, pre-internet, pre-social media days, that's where we were all following the entire world through magazines. But that actually led me to a beginning career in physical therapy, because that was the closest parallel to fitness that I could find occupationally at the time. Exercise science wasn't even really yet a thing. And because this entire industry wasn't developed at all like it is now, I moved into a doctorate in nutrition just for fun. I had no career aspirations for that, but just because I was competing and had just won my pro card, I thought, man, this would really be helpful. Had full intentions of continuing a career in orthopedics. But then I got asked to write for some of the top magazines, again, pre-social media. That's where I developed a bit of a reputation, got invited to science camps and fitness camps. And about 30 years later, here we are, through the whole advent of flexible dieting and macronutrient tracking and non-dietetic, non-medical nutrition coaching, a thing that I never even thought would be a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, it doesn't even seem like that long now in the grand scheme, but we were talking like 5 years ago about just the crazy stuff that the industry has done while I've been coaching, and then we were like, oh gosh, this is like growing so fast. And then it seems like it's just continued to go exponentially. But there's a lot of information that, because there's so many people out there just with the freedom to put anything out, it can get muddy, I feel like, when it comes to what's out there and what people should listen to. So it's always nice knowing that we have people like you helping put out like good quality stuff, research backed and everything. So Tyler, what do you have like kind of top of your head for us to tackle today?
Yeah. So I think, let's maybe quickly talk about, and Joe, maybe you can kind of take over here since, obviously you're our guest. For our audience who just may not be familiar with what are hormones, what do they do in the body, how do they interact, within our system, and then what we're going to want to do, I think we're going to dive into some more of the popular ones. I know the insulin model is still a very talked about topic here, and that insulin rises do cause body fat. So then we can move into that, and as we kind of start to work our way down, we'll kind of, I think, talk about, okay, what hormones actually can help us with some fat loss? How can we, for the lack of a better word, manipulate that through exercise intensity? And what are some of the hormones that we should actually be focusing on when it comes to fat loss?
Yeah.
Uh,
I'd love if we could talk about cortisol a little bit too, because I feel like that's the the boogeyman out there right now that everybody wants to talk about. So sometime in the next little bit.
Right. And that is kind of a great introduction to the topic because everybody does perceive hormones as this just ethereal concept that I know they control everything. And if I'm not succeeding like I should, then it's probably the fault of my hormones. And if I do something wrong, it's going to crash or wreck my hormones and damage my metabolism. And a lot of that is just quite exaggerated and for the most part untrue. But at the base level, hormones are simply chemical messengers. And I shouldn't say simply because they control everything in the body. But created in glands and then they affect other glands, tissues, cells. They are the chemical messengers that tell our body what to do. It may start out as a chemical reaction between two synapses that then creates an electrochemical follow through, and then all of a sudden this cascade is happening throughout the body. And it's interesting, Tyler, that you bring up insulin as a category and Christina, cortisol. You can describe these in all kinds of different categories, and I think it's more helpful to describe them in terms of their function. But a lot of people start with a foundational construction of hormones. So you can have fat-based or lipid-derived hormones. You can have peptide-based hormones or protein-derived hormones. So it just tells you the biochemical structure, doesn't necessarily tell you what they do. So in our world, what gets the biggest play are things like thyroid hormones, the androgens like testosterone, then of course things like cortisol. But I started way back at the beginning of my career looking at just the mechanics of fat loss through that insulin model Tyler described. And even though the insulin model has been a little bit demystified, I don't want to say debunked, but it's not the preeminent way we now think of fat loss and fat gain. It's still there. It's still a very important element. So what I mean by demystified is it used to be thought that that's just how you control everything. You know, you must control carbs because the way insulin goes is the way body composition is going to go. And that still has a huge impact because insulin is an anabolic hormone, meaning when we consume too much carbohydrate or too many calories and insulin goes up, that's because we're now in a calorie surplus and we have the advantage biochemically of being anabolic. We can now support recovery, we can grow. But the antithesis of that is if insulin is too low, I mean, I should put too in quotes, then you're catabolic, which means you could be potentially losing muscle, but that's the pathway to fat loss. You have to be catabolic. You have to have reduced levels of calories under your maintenance levels to lose body fat. So that tension of how do we control that calorically and with carbs, that brings ketogenic dieting into the conversation, is still a big deal, but it's not all about that because we know, again, we still need carbohydrates. We still need some insulin for recovery. We have to manage that whole process. So to me, that's part of the whole digestive milieu of hormones. I would put them together with things like ghrelin and leptin and PYY and all of the downstream digestive hormones that control fat loss, fat gain. Just to answer your question really quick on Christina, we can come back to it. Cortisol is also catabolic. And so when you're dieting, when you're stressed, when you're training, you're going to release more cortisol. And that's a stimulus for catabolism. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You need some cortisol to drive that direction metabolically. I think where people have a misnomer is you just don't want too much of it from things like lack of sleep or lack of recovery, too much overtraining. That's when cortisol can show just too high systemically. And that's what people worry about. It's more of a marketing hype thing than a true concern, as long as you're getting enough sleep and recovering well.
Yeah. That's one of those things I think people look to have it be, oh, well, it must be this, kind of like you said before, where it's like, oh, it could be that thing. And then not realizing how all of those can kind of come into play. And so you had mentioned how you can kind of mess with those when it comes to things like the ketogenic diets or making sure that you have enough carbs. And so where do you see kind of like the biggest thing that trips people up there when it comes to that? If they're saying, I want to keep things nice and even, but I also want to pursue these goals, like, do they tend to go too far one way or another, or what do you tend to see there?
Yeah, I think you have to keep your eye on the big picture first of your goals, your body composition goals. So we get stuck in our heads sometimes worrying about, am I doing this incorrectly? Am I going to hurt myself in this way? And so we tend to sometimes overread bodily symptoms. I was just talking to a client of mine overseas who has a physique to be on the Olympia stage. And yet, in her head, perhaps, is the thought, well, if I get too lean, I'll lose all my muscle. If I diet too hard, then I'm going to look too stringy. And what's standing in her way, because she does have the muscle and the symmetry and the physique, is just saying, this is what my standard has to be, and I just have to get there. I have to be myopically focused on that one thing and not worry so much about, well, what is my insulin level, or what is cortisol doing? I have another client competing in the WMBF World Championships in a couple weeks. Somebody who's been a runner-up on the pro world stage, and he's just known for being just nasty lean. Like he can get there, and he has the muscle to back it up. And I said, well, the one thing we haven't seen yet is just how far we can take you. Like, you have the genetics to be the leanest guy on stage. Can we get you to a place where virtually no other human can get? And he said, yeah, I'm in. And so, we're testing that. We're seeing how he feels with a couple warm-up shows. And if obviously we are concerned with hormonal health, but you're going to see drops and things like that. One of the places I want to go with this conversation is you're going to see a reduction in testosterone. You're going to see a clinical drop in T3 and T4. So how low is too low? How do we prevent those kinds of, ill-fated problems that mean we went too far? What does research show on how we recover that? Is there permanent damage to those systems? Those are the things that we should be rightly worried about.
Yeah.
And that's why I like the fact that a lot of people in this industry now are taking the time to get some labs, so it can be a little bit of an extra job and some expense, but I think that can be worthwhile for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think it also then really speaks to, the resiliency of our body and how it can bounce back, quite well, when we still do get to those levels. And that's not to say that there might be some more permanent damage if we do get that low. Maybe sometimes we don't bounce all the way back, but I know I know you've mentioned this study a couple times, Joe, in some of your other videos that you do on your YouTube, but how people will come back within 8 weeks or 10 weeks as we move back up to that maintenance level. And so again, we kind of come back to this idea of metabolic damage, and it may be being made out to be a boogeyman when it really isn't as bad as it might be. And we do see this nice little bounce back as we maybe drop 40, 50 pounds, we start to come back into that maintenance level, and we do see that rise back into those hormonal levels, back into our metabolism, and we're still in a pretty good spot despite maybe this longer calorie deficit and losing quite a bit of weight.
Yeah, and that's where I want most people to focus. But at the same time, you have to be aware that you could be one of those bell curve outliers where you just don't do well with calorie deficits.
Yeah.
So here's the warning phase. Like, if we could have bells and whistles and alarms going off, like this is the thing that you really do have to worry about. And that is dieting to a willful starvation level, which if you're a male going to 3-4%, female 5-6%, that's low. That's, a human being, our DNA doesn't like to go there. So we have epigenetic ways to make sure we don't starve to death. So for example, in any study on calorie deficits, within a week, you are already seeing massive downregulation in certain hormone productions. One study with young Army soldiers, so you're talking about young men, 18 to 25, In just 8 weeks of rigorous dieting and their normal training, you saw testosterone levels drop from 800 nanograms per deciliter to under 200. But then you also saw when they stopped dieting, it bounced back up. But there is always the chance that somebody doesn't bounce back up quite as high. And that epigenetic protection is this. Imagine the 300,000 or so years of Homo sapien evolution and the 7 million years or so of the Homo genus evolution. And everything up to the last 100 or 200 years has been don't starve, don't starve, don't starve. So our DNA is set up to make sure that we can control that regulation of energy decline. You don't have enough food, boom, you got to start conserving energy very rapidly. So T3 levels, T4 levels, they drop as well. The metabolism is just smashed. But you can control that the best you can by not dieting too aggressively. Give yourself enough time, keeping your sleep and your training schedule appropriate. Because I'll give you a kind of a juxtaposition of two different types of populations. So one study with postmenopausal women, so most of them were over 50, BMIs over 30. And so you're talking now about a group that has a pretty stressed hormone system when it comes to metabolism, right? I mean, just being postmenopausal. And these women being clinically obese, BMI 30 to 35, the study was set up to do this. We want you all to get to a BMI around 25 or under. So not everybody's going to lose the same amount of weight, but that's the goal. It took all subjects, there were about 24 of them, 3 to 5 months to complete. And they did it with 4 10-day inpatient stays. For example, the first 10 days was to baseline them on metabolic carbs, see exactly what kind of nutrition they needed. They supplied the food. And then they came back a couple of times for 10-day stints to re-regulate, reassess. Then at the end, they had another 10-day stint to increase their food intake clinically in an inpatient ward, and then measure these hormones, things like thyroid. So the average weight loss was around 45 pounds, again, finished in 3 to 5 months. So it was a pretty long diet, pretty aggressive. And in the first 10 days, every single subject, I think there was one outlier, every single subject, their T3, T4 dropped exactly 6%, almost to a subject, 6%, which correlated exactly to their resting metabolic rate decline of 6%. So it looks like thyroid controls acute hormone drops, or I'm sorry, metabolic drops. It never got lower than that. And then at the end of that 3 to 5 month process, it only took 10 days of restoring their food back up to maintenance for their RMR and thyroid hormones to come right back up to full 6%. So that shows the resilience Tyler mentioned in a population group that's pretty tough and stressed metabolically already. But the caveat there is at 25 BMI, they weren't exactly 3, 4, 5% body fat. They were still at a body composition level quite high. So do that same study with subjects who get really, really, really lean, like this Army soldiers study, and T3 levels don't come back up that quickly. It doesn't come back up in 10 days. It takes 8 to 12 weeks, and then they're not quite up as high. And that's that epigenetic insult that could be occurring, because the role of epigenetics is to change your genetics. Mm-hmm. So, DNA isn't just something we pass on to our kids and then it's over. Like, I've done my job, I can die. Evolution is done with me. We still have to survive, and we have to survive different environmental changes. So our epigenetic kind of superstructure can change our own DNA. And if you cycle diet, if you yo-yo diet, if you diet like a bodybuilder to extreme levels over and over and over, your body gets better at surviving famine. So your metabolism can permanently be reduced to a decent degree. You don't see a lot of people with severe metabolic regression, but you do see that it may not come up perfectly. Things like leptin and ghrelin have been shown to also not respond back up to full levels. glucagon-like peptide in our own bodies. Everybody's talking about Ozempic and Wegovy and so forth.
Wow.
Your own endogenous productions of those may not come up quite as well. So you may struggle with a little extra hunger. But I think those are the small prices most people would never notice. That's a normal genetic reaction. And the reason I say this is where I want to at least put some caution tape. If you're somebody that just gets hit hard, and we may have all seen a female who struggles with that. She's dieting and she's starting to lose hair. Her thyroid hormones are declining. And some people really do encounter some, medical grade issues because they've just even tried to diet that hard one time.
Right.
But again, extremely, extremely rare. Most of us are going to be pretty resilient, like Tyler said.
I have a
I'm curious.
question. Oh, sorry, Tyler. You want first?
Is there in the data an average calorie difference that we see, or is it very individual in that change where, for example, just throwing out some numbers, someone's maintenance was 2,400, is it going to come down to a 2,100, or is it going to be very 150 calorie difference and barely not that much?
I don't know if you're guessing or if you've
I was just throwing out some numbers.
That's actually pretty close to right on the money.
Okay.
At least in a couple studies and maybe even a meta-analysis, it does show that just globally, all hormones included, the average person who would diet to the level we're describing, and then you're probably going to keep your body comp relatively lower. I mean, imagine somebody in the general population who loses 80 pounds and they never want to gain it back. So they maintain their body fat loss. You are going to see a relative decrease on average. I haven't seen it any higher than 300 calories, and the average is usually stated somewhere between 100 and 150. So, when I was 20 years old dieting for my first bodybuilding contest, if now everything else being equated for age and so forth, if I now can only consume 100 to 150 calories less because I have set my metabolism up to be protective of low calorie instances, then that's what it is. That's the price of being healthy and being in the sport. And that's what I said is kind of an average, not including people who may have a pretty dire reaction.
I have a question about ghrelin and leptin, and then you mentioned like perfectly Ozempic and Wegovy and like all of that, where somehow I think, Tyler, we had started spitballing an idea about this a couple months ago regarding like how, if we even know yet how hormones kind of bounce back from that. And I have a good friend actually who, she's young, I think she's like 25, who's currently on Ozempic, and she's seeing great results. But her and her doctor had always talked about the idea that this isn't, she doesn't want it to be a forever thing and stuff like that. But she had probably a good 40 to 50 pounds to lose. And I think she's about halfway there. And I started getting very curious about like, when they stop those shots, would ghrelin and leptin try to come back like with a vengeance? Do they go right back to where they were before? And for anyone who doesn't know what those two are, for ghrelin, the way I keep them straight in my head is ghrelin makes your stomach growl. And so like, it's going to be the hormone that's telling you I'm hungry. And then leptin is going to be the one that's like, whoa there, you've had enough, let's slow things down. And so we want to keep our ghrelin and leptin in a good place. Obviously, when you're dieting a whole lot, your ghrelin is going to kick up and it's like, hello, why aren't you feeding me? And so the idea with some of these shots is that it's helping suppress that and have you not be like as hungry as much. And so I'm so curious if that bounces back immediately, or if it's something that, like the other stuff, would it kind of stepwise, or would that be person dependent where maybe they don't know yet? Is it all too soon for us to kind of know how that goes?
It's a great question. And so my aunt is a nurse who's been in academia for a long time. She's been a hospital administrator, president of hospital systems and all that. And as soon as these were approved for weight loss by the FDA, she and I had a conversation, and she said, well, obviously they're going to be working now very, very rapidly on maintenance doses, titration, How do you maybe cycle people to stay on a certain dose, even if it's forever? Because if you classify obesity and overweight as a disease, which we now do medically, then it's something that to control. And if the cost is a small dose of a medication like a peptide, and that can save me from dying 20 years early, it can save millions of dollars in diabetes and heart condition, heart related costs, then it's probably worthwhile. We need to know that. So a lot of people are waiting to see, well, gosh, these things just got approved. We're not going to know for a while. True with this population, but these drugs have been approved and in use for 20 years with diabetics.
Mhm.
So we do have a lot of data. We do have a lot of studies on this. And for the most part, the things we know is there does seem to be what's probably an endogenous disruption in the fact that for most people, you get to about a year and it just stops working. And there's some speculation. Are these people more psychologically dependent on food and they just love food so much, kind of like people who've had bariatric surgery, that they're now just starting to eat their way through the symptom reduction of hunger? Are they, maybe they're still feeling that suppression of hunger, but they just love food so much it's now more habit based? Or is it truly endogenous production? Is it disruption of the hypothalamic axis and hunger cues and so forth? So that's where I think the best new research should be focused on. Does everybody need to ramp right up to the highest dose? Or
Right.
can some people just stay on a low dose? Should we be cycling this like we do creatine or something? Like should we give people kind of a break from this so that they can also learn what real hunger is like again? It's not that they haven't felt it for a year and then they're just kind of slammed with it. So in the weight loss population, there is going to have to be, and there will be, a large data set. I mean, think of all these people who at the end of a year are all of a sudden going to be coming off these medications.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's just a lot of curiosity from everybody's perspective because it's a
Right.
different population than just people with diabetes, but people are just recreationally using this, whether they're obese or just a little overweight.
I had told my friend, I was like, as soon as you get to the place where you're starting to ramp down the amount, I'm going to have like weekly questionnaires for you where I'm like, please rate everything on these scales. Cause I'm so curious about that. And like, it makes me sad if it does jump up and like people don't know that, and then it's like, you get hit by this like hunger bus. And so hopefully we learn enough over time to help people find that you have to be like that ramp up. And I think the hardest part, we probably see it a little bit more because we work with people who have been in those very, very low places. And then we try to like reverse diet them up with the idea of a lot of competitors want to maintain as much of their aesthetics as possible. So they're not willing to just let things go. And so I was already explaining to my friend, I was like, well, there's this thing called a reverse diet. And like, we're going to start playing with those in the future. Tyler, I feel like I got you before, like you had something and then I jumped first.
No, I don't think so, but yeah, I mean, I think just even on that topic, and then I kind of want to come back to the T3, T4 that you mentioned and talk about some hypothyroidism. I know that's something that we as coaches deal with a lot, and the idea behind it, and I can't lose weight, but I think the underappreciated of it's okay to be hungry when we're dieting, and it's okay to have hunger. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And, kind of like, Dr. Joe had mentioned at the beginning here is really only in the last 100 years have people been dying from obesity, right? It's this kind of new phenomenon that we are going through, and that maybe it's subconscious, but we feel like we should never feel hungry when it's okay to be hungry. It's something that we should be able to work through. And hey, maybe if you want to look at it in the way of, I know people, oh, you got to eat like our ancestors. Well, guess what? We can be hungry, and that's going
You
to
were
be just
hungry.
like our ancestors. So there you go. Right. So, but like I said, I do want to move into some hypothyroidism talk here, Joe. And does it matter? Like, does it affect fat loss? Does someone who has clinical hypothyroidism, are they going to have a harder time losing body fat? And what are those issues with T3, T4? Is that something that we need to be worried about?
Yeah, it's an interesting double-edged sword because remember, insulin, and then I'm going to link this to thyroid, has pros and cons. And I should say, well, pros and cons to both things we're trying to attain. We're trying to attain as much muscle gain as we can, and then still have the fat loss we want while maintaining muscle mass. So insulin's a good thing, but insulin's a bad thing, but it's a good thing, but it's a bad thing. Thyroid is similar. Thyroid, if you have just endogenously high output of thyroid, that's kind of what makes you an ectomorph. That's why you need to eat a lot more food. You can eat more food and quote, get away with it because you may have a higher, baseline of thyroid hormones. If you don't, and if you're on the low side, then you're very good at sparing muscle, which is good. You're probably going to be better at gaining muscle. And even though you may consume fewer calories in relation to other people, your hunger levels are driven the same way. And so it's all relative. So I'll give you an example. I remember at some point, maybe 20 years ago, my TSH started kind of creeping up and it was at a level that had crossed the line. So if my TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is up, it's because my thyroid gland is not producing enough T3, T4. So the stimulating hormone is being released in higher amounts, trying to stimulate the release and production of T3 and 4. And and I thought, well, it's always been right at that edge. And then it finally went over. And I thought, well, do I need levothyroxine? Do I need Synthroid? Do I need something? And at that time, ironically, the medical uh, regulators kind of moved those levels up. So I kind of chased that bar. I originally crossed 3, and then all of a sudden they said, well, you're really not hypothyroid until you're 4. And then I crossed 4,
You're
and
like,
then,
let's
well, now
go.
you're not now it's 5. So I finally up to 5, and my doctor said, yeah, we should probably give you some Synthroid. And I was actually kind of excited because being hypothyroid, I'm always freezing in the winter, all of those other thyroid conditions. And I thought, man, I get, this thyroid medication now. I'm going to be shredded. I'm going to take this and I'm just going to get so lean. I'll be able to eat more food. And all I remember was when I went on 25 micrograms is like the first day, my hands were like a little warm and sweaty. I'm like, wow, I've never felt like my hands warm. Nothing happened. My TSH levels barely came down. So about 6 months later, she bumped me up to 50 micrograms. I'm like, yes, I'm going to lose so much body fat. It's going to be
Excited.
great. Now I'm back down to maybe 2.5 or 3, which is kind of midline. And I just feel no different. I mean, I'm not eating any more food. Sleep hasn't changed. It's just literally done nothing. I can't eat more food. It's just basically controlling you within those ranges. So, if you're somebody who doesn't mind taking PEDs of any sort, and you're taking T3, you're taking thyroid hormones, you're taking things in that class, even clenbuterol, you're gonna see a surge of metabolic activity. But you're also gonna have insomnia, you're gonna have suicidal ideation and anxiety. All of those things that increase your metabolism, you have those correlational negatives. So an awful lot of people who try that decide, holy hell, this is awful. Like I would rather just be normal.
Yeah.
So whether you're hypothyroid like me, okay, I can't eat quite as much as maybe the average guy at my height and weight and age, but I'm also the same level of hunger that they are. I feel the same. I'm just eat a little less. And the protective quality of being hypothyroid is aging even slows down because a slower metabolism means you are aging cellularly more slowly. So pros and cons to everything, but thyroid hormone is definitely a controlling factor of metabolism, but it's just not the biggest deal when it comes to intentional weight loss.
Yeah, and I was watching one of your videos on this topic, just in lieu of this conversation. And one thing that kind of really stuck out to me, and maybe you can expand on this a little bit, is people always have this idea that hypothyroidism causes obesity. But in that video, you had actually talked about how obesity actually causes hypothyroidism. So maybe you just want to expand on that a little bit, and maybe that's a very big surprise to a lot of people, because I know clients that I talk to, and they have hypothyroidism, like, oh, I just can't lose weight, right? And so there is actually maybe I don't know if juxtaposition is the correct word, but it's actually the other way around potentially.
Yeah, being overweight and obese is just so devastating to the human body, to physiology. You cannot imagine what is really happening under the hood when you look at just being unnecessarily overweight. And so body fat is often thought of as just like fat cells in our body, a very passive tissue. Fat collectively is an organ system that has a vascular supply. It even creates hormones like leptin, and it creates cytokines and chemokines, which create inflammation in the body, systemic inflammation. So anytime you are overweight and you're producing this systemic inflammation that is just fluctuating with your body composition, you can really put a lot of health systems in peril, including, as you said, causing some of the hormone disruptions that we think caused the body fat. It reminds me of even androgens like testosterone. Testosterone is a cholesterol-derived hormone, and testosterone is obviously associated with muscle mass. And so somewhere along the line, everybody thought, okay, well, the best way to support and have more testosterone is eat fat. Give me all the red meat, give me all the egg yolks and so forth. The higher fat diet you have, the lower your testosterone goes. The higher your body fat is, your testosterone will drop. So there's kind of a sweet spot. You can also be on the clinically low side if your calories start getting below 20% of your calories of fat, then you can see decreases in endogenous testosterone. But also on the other side, if your calories get above about 40%, then from fat, then you'll see decreases in testosterone. And I will say, while we're on this topic of androgens, testosterone has virtually nothing to do with fat loss. Even shocking to me with clients who are big PED users, a guy who's 5'9" and 260 pounds shredded and using every anabolic under the sun, you would think, well, gosh, that level of steroids, the body fat is just falling off. It's actually almost the opposite, because again, you're creating that supraphysiological anabolic environment. And remember, it takes catabolism to lose body fat. It's very ironic that the more testosterone you take when it comes to TRT and even PEDs, sometimes it gets harder to lose body fat. A little bit of an oxymoron.
What I've loved is throughout all of this, like, it really just reinforces, I think, like the balanced approach with a lot of stuff too. Because I love how you've mentioned like, things, testosterone being cholesterol derived and like different things. I feel like people forget a lot of the times that to try and get all of this stuff into a good place, but doing things like keto, right? You mentioned if your fats are going above 40%, which a lot of people who aren't going full keto or like don't have a reason to, but they're messing around kind of in that realm. And so maybe carbs are just on the lower end, fats are like through the roof, proteins, like, I don't know, maybe like if they choose steaks that day. And then they can't figure out why things are all over the place. And I think a lot of those like back and forth approaches too, what can be so nerve-wracking is like, I feel like they send things so opposite, like with like what they're doing, right? Where they're going from like, oh, well, I'm going to be like carnivore. And then I literally had a conversation with somebody where over the last 6 months, she's been both vegan and carnivore and like, trying to chase, because everybody says like, oh, well, if you do this thing. And like, I talk to a lot of people in like the menopausal, or just, I kind of think of it as like hormonally vulnerable populations, where I work with a lot of women who are pre or postnatal, or they're pre or postmenopausal. And so we have a lot of things just going up and down and stuff like that. And there's so much information out there where it's like, well, this is the secret that you need to do to kind of smooth it all out. And really, I mean, what I'm getting from a lot of the conversation is just being smart about stuff and then keeping an eye on it. And then, when you get into the conversations about people who are going prep level lean, like it's going to mess stuff up. Like you have to kind of plan for that. And I had talked to a client recently who's getting back on stage for the first time after, I think it's been 6 years. And now we're competing masters. So she's just in kind of like a body that responds differently to things. And she's been hitting some of those places, even down to like digestion, where she's like, well, it's weird, I can't go to the bathroom as often and things like that. I'm like, well, that's what happens when we're starving you, essentially. Like your body's real sad and it's trying to hold on to everything it can. And so there's just a lot of these like downstream effects. And I really appreciate the way you would explain those, where these things can lead to different stuff, because I think more often than not, we're seeing people who are experiencing a lot of those when maybe like they wouldn't have if they didn't have the information to just go like kind of mess with it.
Right.
I've had clients get put on levothyroxine where it was just like, oh, well, my doctor said, I don't know, it might work. It might help me lose weight a little bit. So we're trying it. And I'm like, oh, okay. How long are we playing this experiment? Like,
Yeah.
what are the markers that we're shooting for? Like,
Great doctor. Let's see if this works.
Yeah, right.
Well,
So
so that's Christina. That's if I could just address real quick, Tyler, Christina's thought there. I've done the same thing. I've done pure ketogenic dieting a couple of different times to feel the effects and to measure them the best I could. I've done 2 long stints of different types of vegetarianism, both with case study mentalities where I was hydrostatically weighed and had blood labs, at the IU Med Center and stuff like that. And part of that is because I just want to experience what clients experience if they want to go different directions, but also to see, I mean, I can read the data, but I want to see, how it really affects my body as an N of 1. And it's really remarkable because every time you go to one of those extremes, it's never great. I've never felt worse in my life than on both of those 2 diets, even though they're polar opposites.
yeah. All right. So, I mean, we've covered, I think, some of the more popular ones out there in terms of what people imagine affect fat loss a lot, right? So our insulin, our leptin, our adrenaline, testosterone, we've talked about here, hypothyroidism. So I think now let's get into maybe some ones that aren't quite talked about in terms of, okay, what actually can help us in terms of fat loss. And so I know this is going to be more in the adrenal glands. We're going to be talking about norepinephrine and epinephrine and how exercise intensity can also relate to this, as well as cortisol. So Dr. Joe, I mean, if you want to kind of take this away here and kind of start to talk about, all right, now that we've covered the ones that actually don't help, what are the ones there we can take advantage of? What variables can we manipulate to aid in our fat loss journey?
Excellent. And I know you said that like you did because I'm going to hit this one pretty hard.
Yes.
Just because of the pure veracity at which it can help with body fat loss. So just as a quick summary, we started talking about things like the insulin and glucagon fulcrum, and all of the other digestive hormones. So, our food intake, how much we're consuming, the macronutrient distribution. We do have some control over where we can optimize fat loss within those hormones, that grouping. We don't want to lose too fast. We don't want to lose too slow, and we don't want undue metabolic suppression, that sort of thing. We don't want to risk losing muscle mass. So starting there, insulin, glucagon, all of that. Then thyroid hormone, it's going to do what it's going to do. There's not a lot we can control again, except for sleep and recovery and the pace of weight loss. The androgens, testosterone, et cetera, same thing, sleep, recovery, not losing too quickly, just to make sure you're protecting lean body mass. Growth hormone, cortisol, things like that, they're a little bit more regulatory related when it comes to anabolism and catabolism. So I kind of look at them as extensions of what we're doing through nutrition and supporting things like thyroid and testosterone. The catecholamine hormones are the adrenal-based hormones that are produced when we exercise, when we do anything with some kind of intentional activity bent. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating how normal, low, and moderate intensity activity, there's not a lot that happens. Okay, you're burning a few extra calories, you're liberating body fats, from body fat cells through things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, but it's just very tame until you get to a super excited level, exciting the sympathetic nervous system. So as soon as you get up to maximum capacity, like all of a sudden your heart rate is bam, level 10, then the shit hits the fan. And I'm talking about Wingate type sprints, maximum high intensity interval training where appropriate to your skill level, your ability to do it safely, you can get 1,000 and all the way up to 1,600% increases in one study of epinephrine and norepinephrine and even growth hormone. Meaning that out of the hormones that can liberate adipose tissue, can take fatty acids out of your body fat cells so that you can use it as energy. Out of all the hormones we've mentioned, these are the sledgehammers. These are the ones that can do it the fastest, the best, the most reproducibly. But it takes that kind of training. And it was a fad for a while, right? Like everybody was doing HIIT. Everybody was like, I mean, even coaches were prescribing, do this many wind gates, do 2, do 3, do 4, and then we'll cycle it back and this and that. And it is a form of training. You're going to have, tendon soreness. You're going to have perhaps joint soreness, depending on how you're doing it. Your legs are going to be sore like you did a squat workout. So you can't do it all the time, but for functional reasons, for athletic reasons, and especially to help people not plateau with fat loss, I think we all have to be cognizant of leaving these as tools to be used. I mean, to really know how to use them well, because that is absolutely one of the ways you can extend fat loss into levels that you may thought were just too elusive for you. Because we also know that non-exercise activity just tends to go down, right? Like as soon as we're not eating as much, our bodies just start to shut down from a sympathetic nervous system standpoint. We don't want to do as much. Studies even show we blink less, like we chew less. Because again, the body wants to conserve energy. We go into that epigenetic mode of survival. So, what are your thoughts on that now that I know you've heard it a couple times, Tyler?
I fully agree. I mean, the data obviously backs it up, and I think utilizing it as a mode of some type of cardio, again, based on someone's cardiovascular health, their level of training, I think it is always fantastic. And I think also for me, using it with, more obese clients, I've seen some great benefit from that as well. And just in terms of helping them hormonally and getting back into that mode of just shocking that sympathetic nervous system, like you mentioned, because a lot of them don't move a whole lot. They are maybe still doing, 5,000-6,000 steps a day, but we're not creating that cellular disturbance, within the system. And if, we know obesity causes a, kind of a decrease in some of these hormones, and I found it's a great way not only to kind of shock the system, if you will, but cardiovascular health as well, and increasing cardiac stroke volume, and just getting them even to a more healthier spot, increasing mitochondrial density, and so that they can utilize more energy. Maybe it's pushing then into a better level of anaerobic capacity within their training. And so certainly we want to pay attention to overall recovery. I mean, like you mentioned, that is maybe the biggest con, if you will, of HIIT cardio, and that you can only do it so often within a week. I don't know if you have specific parameters that you'll put on people, but I would say probably no more than 3 times a week, depending on how many they are doing at once. And I think two, we should establish what is actually HIIT cardio. Okay.
Right.
I think that is a big one as well, that people kind of get wrong, is, oh, I'm going to a HIIT class and it's 45 minutes. Like, that's not HIIT. Like, that isn't true HIIT. And so, I know in the data, it's typically an 8-second sprint with a 12-second recovery. I would be curious to get some of your thoughts, though, is can you push it to a 20-30-second mark? I mean, in my mind, again, anaerobically, and we look at energy systems, that should be the upper limit, but what would then be the recovery there? Are we still looking at only a 30-second recovery? Like, is there kind of a cutoff that you do want to be looking at on that recovery to push side?
Yeah, it's such great information there. There's so much to go through, Tyler. First of all, think of it as a continuum. I do want to give a quick nod to what you said about mitochondria, because mitochondria are literally the predictors of your life. And if you can create more mitochondria because you exercise at higher levels of intensity, I mean, that is so indicative of how you're going to end up in your later years. So, high intensity interval training is a classification, like you said, that specifically is tested to go through ATP, so the anaerobic energy system maximally, which means you can't take another step. There's a reason the 100-meter sprint is that length. Then if you want a 200-meter sprint, a 400-meter sprint, you're going to start using glucose as energy, just not ATP exclusively. So now you're in the glycolytic energy system, and then you're going to start going into oxygen debt. And so uh, the goal of that kind of research, which shows maximum stimulation of epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, are the fact that you are completely going through all three of those systems maximally. And that's why you don't have to do it for a long length of time. If your first foray into this is that you're just going to do it for 1 minute, which could be 5 sprints, so to speak, 8 seconds on, 12 seconds off, that's great. Do that. See how you feel the next day. Do it again in 2 or 3 days so you know you're recovering. But then there is also just high intensity training,
Right.
which is, well, I'm gonna kind of go at a 400-meter sprint. Like I'm gonna go for a full minute as hard as I can for that minute, because now I'm not only getting close to emptying out ATP, but I'm really getting into glycolytic energy stores. And you can train at all those levels, and you're just going to get a scaled version of those catecholamine effects. So there's nothing wrong with it. And I think it should be said that you can really do yourself a favor by orthopedically managing that. If one day I've done these kinds of sprints on an assault bike and I feel pretty great, like that didn't really bother me that much. Well, maybe 2 days later, I can do them on a treadmill in real running sprints. Well, now all of a sudden, wow, my low back's a little tight, my knees a little sore. So my next one, I better go back to the bike. Or I might, I like to do them on an arc trainer. I specifically do that type of training, or a sled, a prowler. You could be functional exercise, burpees. I mean, you can do anything to get your heart rate elevated like that to maximum intensities, and kind of spread out that force throughout your body for better recovery.
Right. I would be curious, like actual resistance training and lifting in a high intensity manner, maybe not in the sense of 8 seconds on, 12 seconds off, but is there still a fairly defined effect on norepinephrine and epinephrine and fat loss with just resistance training, or do we really only see that effect with this type of hit that we're talking about?
Yeah, the acute fat loss isn't going to be the same, but it almost gets back into the mitochondria, and now even different muscle fiber types, type 1, type 2, fast twitch, slow twitch, intermediate, transitional, that sort of thing. And this is my home base because I love high intensity training.
Yes, I know.
And and if you were to look at my physique through my pro bodybuilding career, I mean, their genetics are genetics, just the morphology of your muscle tissue. But I will go to my deathbed claiming that I got the most out of my physique I possibly could, because I did such high intensity glycolytic type training in the upper levels of that research. You look at James Krieger and Schoenfeld and so forth, everybody who's looking at, well, actually 20 and 30 rep sets actually have a good effect. Like, it's not junk volume as long as you're failing in those rep ranges, because just like those sprints, you're putting stress on the glycolytic energy system, even though it's a weight lifting exercise, and you're forcing mitochondrial change. One more thing, if I could tell one little anecdotal story before we end, because I've just, it's a personal story. I turned 55 last month. When my dad turned 55, he started his journey to his deathbed, in the fact that he was seeing a cardiologist for congestive heart failure, some issues like that. By the time he was 59, he had a pacemaker. And by 65, he was gone. And just because of just not taking care of his health, overeating, obesity, not exercising. And just serendipitously, I was in a heart scanner last month, arms over my head, getting a calcium score, because my family doctor just loves to overprotect me. She's very kind and wants to keep me healthy. And so I'm like, wow, I mean, sure, like I'm always interested in information and data. But then when I was in that machine and getting a CAT scan on my heart, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm 55. I eat a lot of fucking cheeseburgers. Like I've never turned down ice cream unless I'm dieting. Like, what if one of my one of my coronary vessels is 20% blocked? What if one's 50% blocked? What if I'm surprised and just because of genetics, it's 90, one of them is 90% blocked? Like I'm literally like having these like, wow, like I may not like having this information. And again, as a competitive bodybuilder and somebody who doesn't have the best genetics to be lean or stay lean, 3 of my 4 siblings have been 100+ pounds overweight their whole lives. I have an uncle who died at over 500 pounds. My dad, again, congestive heart failure in his 50s. My calcium score was 0. I have not one shred of athero or arteriosclerosis in my coronary vessels. And I can only attribute that to the consistency of 40+ years of training and a lot of that time training very aggressively. A lot of high intensity cardio, a lot of functional cardio, as well as, high intensity weight training as well. So I'm telling you, man, I mean, move, exercise, do it to your highest capacity as well as you can recover. And that's going to be your happiest moments later in life.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And I know that's something we do talk a lot about, on this podcast is the longevity, of this is, as important as our short-term goals are and our aesthetic goals are, this really is truly about setting us up for the rest of our lives in terms of the fountain of youth. Like this is what Cortez was looking for and that doing this on a very consistent basis, pushing ourselves. And I mean, like you said, though, you've never turned down a cheeseburger or you never turned down ice cream. And the fact that like you still can enjoy your life and have those things and still be a very healthy person and very much trying to stay away from these extremes and going in all these crazy ways. And I think on a hormonal side and how much I think nowadays it's so popular. It seems like every online coach is a hormone expert and I can fix your hormones and this and that. And it really truly is just about balance and paying attention to our training intensity and things like that. I mean, I've trained with you in Evansville. I remember doing a leg press set of 20, 30, 40, and we were adding weight, not just reducing weight. And I've had you as my coach and those those super set or compound sets of, a leg extension into a goblet squat, things like that. And it does push you mentally, but there is that health component as well. It's not like I'm just trying to torture you. I'm also trying to get you a bit healthier and push yourself. So, I mean, I think this has been a fantastic conversation and just kind of laying out a lot of the popular things that are out there and maybe some of the misinterpretations that people have on certain hormones and things I think that maybe hormones people have never heard of, like norepinephrine and epinephrine, and how can we actually utilize these for fat loss. And so for now, I mean, that's all that I have for this conversation. Christina, I don't know if you have any last minute questions here that you were wondering about.
No, I love that it wrapped up with really, it comes down to like work hard, play hard, essentially. Like work your ass off, push yourself to limits. And I mean, that's been my favorite thing as I've gotten older, as I've gone through different phases as an athlete and a coach and stuff like that. So when you guys got into the cardio conversation, that's like my jam. I just did my first ultra 2 weeks ago. And
Wow.
so but I noticed even like we've been in the zone 2 era, right? For like, that's the cool thing now. And since it's just chugging along, I can set a pace and forget it. So I was like, oh, I can rock zone 2. But even I had this like craving when I was done with that training to get back to like fast. I was like, I just want to go back to that stuff. This week was my first week back in the gym and I'm so sore. I can't put my hair in a ponytail. It wasn't even like hard stuff. I'm like appalled by how sore I am. But I have pivoted myself very much into, because I watched my grandparents. We lost them both on my maternal side a couple of years ago, and a lot of the stuff, they were in their like very early 80s and dealt for like 10 to 15 years with things like Parkinson's, congestive heart failure, but like stuff where they didn't react to it. Like it was just like, I'll just take the medicine and like, this is what happens. And as sad as it is to watch this generation, like that generation kind of go through a lot of that stuff, I love that it's kind of waking up people coming through and up where it's like, no more. Like it stops here. We're going to work hard. Highlight the fact that you can work your ass off, but it's not going to work if you don't recover. You're just going to cause more problems and run yourself into the ground. And so really you just got to work your ass off, rest up, do it again, and fall in love with that process, because you got to do it until you're in the ground.
And just to reiterate what you're talking about in terms of, and I hate to use the word balance, but even high intensity cardio is not the end all be all. It's one good tool and one that's underutilized, but there is a lot of data that show zone 2 cardio and even low intensity cardio for greater amounts of time is great. It's fantastic. It's not going to be your only tool to use for fat loss, especially when we're decreasing NEAT through the dieting phase. So you do need to use those stipends of small amounts of high intensity interval training if you want. I think it's very helpful. But yeah, absolutely. In a time when we are still, to this day, it baffles my mind that we're still seeing increases in obesity and overweight. It's creating that polarization between almost two groups. Like more people are exercising and taking care of their health, and just more aren't. And it's a tough place to be.
Yeah. Come to the dark side, everyone.
Yeah. Join us. Well, Dr. Joe, just want to thank you for your time and just all your knowledge. And if there is a place that people can watch more of your stuff, where can they reach you? Where can they find you? Just maybe plug yourself a little bit here of where they can get some more great information from yourself.
Yeah, the Diet Doc channel on YouTube, as well as the dietdoc.com. And then my name at Joe Klemczewski is where I'm at, Instagram and Facebook.
Yeah.
So easy enough there.
Okay, cool. I don't know if we can maybe drop that down in the description, a couple of links. I know you've also got a great YouTube and you've got some great content there that covers this kind of stuff and more. It's always fantastic. And I know it's, one of the only places I always go to for information and learning. And so in a world where there is a lot and it can seem very confusing on who to listen to, I know here at Pro Physique, we can say without a doubt, like Dr. Joe is probably the number one up there where you're going to get the best information you can. So definitely encourage everyone to go check him out, go learn some great stuff. He's also a pretty cool guy too. So that's never a bad thing either. Yeah, I guess, hit subscribe, leave some comments. If you guys ever want to ask us questions, things that you want us to cover in, later pods, definitely let us know. And thanks for joining us, everyone.